When you first start the carnivore diet, it can be incredibly confusing. You're told, eat all the meat you like, eat all the dairy you like, eat according to appetite. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Some people have adverse reactions to certain meats. Some meats are better for losing weight. Some meats are better at reducing inflammation. And the same goes with dairy. In fact, some types of dairy can re-trigger reward pathways and bring back sugar cravings. Don't get me wrong, all carnivore items are better than consuming plants. However, although many people don't like to admit it, carnivore is not as simple as eat all the meat and all the dairy you like and achieve all your goals. So in today's video, we're going to be ranking every single carnivore food, from S tier, meaning it's elite, all the way down to D tier. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which carnivore items are the best to consume, and which ones you want to avoid if you want to have the best results. First up, we have lamb, which is just incredible in every aspect. You see, lamb is a ruminant animal, meaning it has a complex, multi-chambered stomach, which is able to effectively break down anything that it's fed, as well as the fact that with lamb, more often than not, they're at least predominantly fed grass. And because grass is the species appropriate diet for lamb, it means it's able to break it down properly, and it results in their flesh being very pure, I guess you could say. Lamb is incredibly nutrient dense, which means it's going to be incredibly satiating, which is great for weight loss. Lamb is straight in the S tier. Next up, we have chicken, in particular farmed chicken. You see, the problem with farmed chicken is that they're typically fed grains, and unlike lamb, which as we talked about are ruminant animals, chickens are monogastric animals, meaning they only have a singular stomach, which is not very effective at breaking down what it's fed. And so because these chickens are fed grains, which obviously a chicken in the wild typically does not eat these ultra processed grains with like 30 different ingredients, what happens is the chickens aren't very effective, and so the rubbish ingredients that are in these grains end up in the flesh of the chicken. In fact, when we examine the fatty acid content of these chickens, what we find is that they're incredibly high in omega-6 fatty acids, such as linoleic acid. Now this right here is not good for our health. When the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio is too skewed in favor of the omega-6s, it results in unfavorable health outcomes for us due to the inflammation it causes. The saying "you are what you eat" holds to be very true for every species, especially species like chickens who don't have very complex digestive systems. So because they're eating this garbage, their flesh also ends up containing this garbage, and consequently it really affects how we're going to rank chicken. So we're going to put farmed chicken in the B tier. Okay, so we know that farmed chicken's not the best, but what about pasture-raised chicken? What pasture-raised means is that the chickens are free to roam paddocks, and in these paddocks they dig up all sorts of things. They dig up worms, they eat some of the grasses, they eat some of the leaves, they eat a wide variety of foods. Now this is much better, and it ends up in the chicken being a lot healthier because it's much closer to its species appropriate diet. However, there's still actually one problem with this, and that is that wild chickens don't actually live in big open paddocks. If they did, they would get destroyed by predators like foxes. It would be an incredibly easy kill for these carnivorous animals if chickens were out in the open. So what wild chickens do is they actually go into more foresty areas. The trees in these forests allow them to blend in a lot better, which is crucial for their survival. So the pasture-raised chickens and the chickens that live in forests do actually eat slightly different diets, which is not ideal for us, because when a species eats a certain plant for an extended period of time, they begin to develop adaptations to break down the defense compounds in that plant. A cool example of this is goats, who have developed an enzyme in their saliva called tannins, which breaks down one of the defense compounds in grass known as tannins. So what ends up happening is, because these chickens aren't eating the same plants that they typically would in the wild, these plants still, to at least some degree, aren't ideal for them. And so because they can't break them down perfectly, the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in pasture-raised chickens is still higher than, say, like grass-fed beef or lamb. However, it's still considerably lower than it is with these grain-fed chickens. And chicken does also contain a lot of nutrients, so chicken is going in the A tier. Next up, we have salmon. First, we're going to look at wild salmon. Now, wild salmon's great. It gets to eat its species-appropriate diet of other fish. These salmon are incredibly healthy, they have beautiful orange skin, and they're also incredibly high in every single essential nutrient that we need. In fact, there are populations that have survived on almost exclusively salmon, such as the historic Inuit people. Now the Inuit people have actually modernized and have started eating some of our foods. And shockingly enough, they've also gone from a very healthy population to a population that has all the diseases that we have since making that switch. But the historic Inuit people actually lived on a diet exclusively of salmon. However, there is still one small problem with wild salmon, and that is, well, the mass amounts of pollution. The problem with all fish nowadays is that they do contain microplastics. As we all know, many corporations and I guess individuals to some degree dump large amounts of plastics in the ocean, which spreads far and wide, and the fish end up eating it. So most of the time when you're eating fish, regardless as to whether it's wild or farmed, you are eating at least a small amount of plastic. If I could time travel back 200 years ago and make this video then, salmon would be in the S tier because it didn't have this issue. However, because at least to some degree you're going to be eating a small amount of plastic, wild salmon is going to have to go on the A tier. And then, well, farmed salmon. This right here is a disgrace. Like with farmed chickens, farmed salmon are not fed their species appropriate diet. They're fed these rubbish pellets that are so nutritionally void that sometimes they have to add an orange cover, like literally get a brush, get some orange food dye or whatever it is, rub it on it, just so the salmon's orange. This salmon, again, it's incredibly high in the fats that we don't want, and the amount of this fat is just absurd. Because these fish are eating what they're not meant to eat, they get extremely fat. Now, this would be fine if the fats were healthy fats. However, it simply is not. So as a result of all of these factors, farmed salmon is going to have to go on the B tier with farm chicken. Next up, we're going to look at cheese. Now, cheese itself is not terrible. However, there are a number of issues that I see with dairy. The first being that it's incredibly addictive. Dairy contains a compound known as beta-casomorphin, which essentially acts as an opioid-like substance that makes you addicted. Now, I'm sure we've all experienced this. Once you start eating cheese, or just any dairy product for that matter, it's incredibly hard to stop eating it, as well as the fact that dairy isn't as nutrient dense as meat, which therefore means it's not going to fill you up as much. Think about it. Have you ever actually been full from eating cheese or any dairy for that matter alone? As we know, on Carnivore, we eat till we're full. It's possibly the only diet where you can never be hungry and achieve the body of your dreams. So let's think about this. If we've got two different foods, let's say we've got some fatty ruminant meat, such as lamb like we talked about earlier. Chances are if we eat the exact same amount of each, we're still going to be hungry from the cheese, but we'll be full from the lamb. So then we're going to eat more, and we're just going to eat more and more energy, which is going to slow the weight loss down. Now, raw cheese is definitely better than pasteurized cheese. The reason being that when something's pasteurized, it's heated to a high temperature to kill the bacteria in it, which allows it to last for longer. The problem being that in doing so, it denatures many of the proteins in the dairy, which then makes it inflammatory. I find personally that if I consume pasteurized dairy, my skin breaks out in acne. Cheese is not terrible. You don't have to avoid it completely, but it just is nowhere near as good as any cut of meat, to tell you the truth. So for that reason, it's going in the C tier. Next up, we have beef, probably the greatest food on the planet. For all the reasons that I talked about with lamb, it is just incredible. It's incredibly nutrient dense. The fatty acid profile in it is essentially perfect. And I mean, it just tastes incredible too. Beef is quite literally the perfect food. So beef is going straight in the S tier, right next to lamb. And for those of you who are wondering, there's very little difference in how good each of them is for you. So if you're contemplating, do I eat beef, do I eat lamb? They're both very similar. Next up, we have pork. And due to the fact that I don't want to repeat myself and make this a repetitive video, everything I said with chicken applies to pork. Pork and chicken are incredibly similar in nearly every aspect. They're both monogastric animals, they both have a very similar nutrient density, and they both have the exact same issues as to whether they're pasture raised or grain fed. So everything I've said about chicken, it applies to pork, and therefore they're going to be ranked essentially the same. One thing that's interesting with pork is that pork is actually meant to be a red meat if it's fed its proper species appropriate diet. Growing up, every time I went to the supermarket, I would see pork completely white. So I just always assumed, well, pork's a white meat. The reason for this is the same with salmon. The grains they're fed are so nutritionally void that they do not contain sufficient amounts of nutrients for pork to develop their natural red color. Wild pork is in the A tier and grain-fed pork is in the B tier. After finishing filming, I just realized that I forgot bacon. What a travesty that would have been. Bacon is essentially pork, so it's going to have all the same issues like pork does that chicken has. But there's one other thing you really need to consider about bacon, and that is that often bacon isn't actually bacon. And what I mean by this is that when you look at the back of the packaging with bacon, it's often only like 85% bacon. It's like 15% preservatives, additives, fillers, just a whole bunch of other garbage. So be careful with the bacon you're selecting. If you can find proper bacon that's like 99% pork with 1% salt, that's great. It's the exact same as pork. but make sure you're getting bacon. That's actually bacon, and it doesn't contain all these rubbish ingredients. Anyways, apologies for nearly forgetting it. Back to where I was before. Next up, we have eggs. Eggs are great. You can often get them very cheap. They taste good. However, eggs again can run the exact same issues as chicken. If they're fed grains, these grains typically end up in them. Eggs are incredibly nutrient dense, in particular the yolk. If you're getting pasture raised eggs, they are incredible. They actually would be close to an S tier, but you just cannot put anything in the same level as ruminant meat. So for that reason, they're going to be high A tier if they're pasture raised, and then B tier if they're from a grain fed chicken. Next, we're going to look at wild game, and wild game typically is ruminant animals. Deer, elk, venison, you name it, anything like that, they are ruminant animals. Now, if you can find fatty wild game, they would be S tier. However, unfortunately, these wild meats are typically very lean. They do a lot of moving around, so they burn off all their fat, and humans cannot survive eating only protein. What happens when all we do is eat protein is we develop something known as rabbit starvation. To survive, humans need either carbohydrates, which isn't ideal for us, or fats, and because this wild game only contains protein, we cannot survive eating it alone. And so whilst it's a great addition, because it's going to contain none of the bad stuff whilst also being incredibly nutrient dense, because we can't eat it alone, it's going to have to go in the A tier. Next up, we're going to look at milk. First up, raw milk. Now, raw milk is definitely better than pasteurized milk due to the issues with pasteurization that we talked about earlier. However, even with raw milk, it's high in carbohydrates in the form of glucose and lactose. Now, we all know this, it has an incredibly sweet taste to it. And the problem with this is that, one, it's going to re-trigger cravings. When our brains release dopamine, which is a pleasure hormone, as a result of the sweet taste, it re-triggers these dopamine reward pathways, and it can make us crave other sugary items. So if you are someone who's had a sugar addiction, this is definitely not ideal, which is most people, because as we can see looking across society, most people are addicted to sugar. So for a lot of people, drinking raw milk is going to do a lot more harm than good. Another problem with the carbohydrates this contains is that when we eat carbohydrates, it spikes our blood sugar significantly. And we have another hormone called insulin that also rises to bring our blood sugar back down. Now, the problem with this is that as soon as our insulin levels rise, it blocks another hormone called leptin. Now, the role of leptin is essentially to send a signal to our brain saying, we don't need to eat anymore, we've got all we need. So as you can imagine, when this leptin signaling is blocked before it can get to our brain, it's not ideal, it's going to cause us to overeat. And for some people, it will result in weight loss, either plateauing or gaining weight even. Now, I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, and I hate to be a dairy hater, but I'm also under the belief that dairy from another species may not be super ideal for humans. In fact, up until about 10,000 years ago, we could even break the stuff down. When we look at human fossils from around that time, we had none of the LCT gene, otherwise known as the lactose gene, which meant that 10,000 years ago, everyone was lactose intolerant. And when we look at the hunter-gatherer tribes of wild humans who have not started farming and therefore they have not been drinking milk, they also have none of this gene. All dairy products contain a number of hormones designed for the growth of baby cows. They're high in estrogen as well as many other hormones. And the effects that these hormones have on us is pretty unknown, to be honest with you. There's not a lot of science on the topic. Now, drinking some milk every now and then is nowhere near as bad as eating the ultra-processed garbage. It's not going to make you sick, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But if you're trying to absolutely optimize your health, I don't think dairy is super ideal for most people. So because of these reasons, raw milk is going into the C tier. And then when it comes to pasteurized milk, we have obviously all the issues with raw milk as well as the pasteurization. So that's going to go in the D tier. Now, this doesn't mean it's terrible for you. It just means it's nowhere near as good for you as some of the other items on this list. So what about cream? Well, again, cream typically is pasteurized, so it's going to have that issue. Now, the good thing about cream is that it contains no carbohydrates, so it's not going to block our hunger signaling to the same degree. However, there's a massive issue with cream in the sense that it's incredibly easy to overconsume. You see, cream is essentially just fat, and unlike, say, fat that would have with our ground beef or with our steak, it's not incredibly satiating. So because it's incredibly high in fat, it also means it's incredibly high in energy. Now, obviously, body fat on our body is stored energy. So the more energy we consume from foods, the less energy our body's going to take from its own fat, and therefore it's going to slow our weight loss down. Now, again, this isn't to say that cream is terrible. In fact, if you were to only have a very small amount of cream, it's not that bad at all. However, due to the fact that it's so incredibly easy to overconsume, it's going to go in the D tier along with milk. Next up, we have goat. Now, again, goat is a ruminant animal, so it's great. Incredibly nutrient dense, lots of the good fat. The only issue with goat is, again, it's often very lean. So for that reason, goat is going in the A tier, but if you can get a fatty goat, it would be in the S tier. Next up, we have turkey, and again, turkey is virtually identical to chicken. I'm not going to bother wasting your time repeating everything I said earlier about chicken. So everything I said about chicken, apply that to turkey. Next up, we have butter. Now, butter is pretty good. It's definitely more satiating than cream, at least in my experience, and it's great for cooking in. However, again, butter is dairy. I see a lot of people mass consuming butter as their main source of fat. Now, this isn't necessarily bad. In fact, butter contains lots of essential nutrients, and the fat that's in butter does hold a good fatty acid profile. However, it's just not quite as nutrient dense as tallow, and because it's pasteurized and because it's dairy, it is going to be somewhat inflammatory. However, I do think that butter, pending you're not over-consuming it once again, because like with cream, it's incredibly high in energy, I actually do think it is the best form of dairy. So for that reason, butter is going to go in the B tier. And then ghee is essentially butter that's had its protein and moisture content stripped from it. So ghee is very similar to butter, and therefore ghee is going to sit alongside butter in the B tier. And then finally, we have yogurt and kefir, which in my opinion are better than any form of milk due to the fact that they contain less carbohydrates. There's also the argument that due to the cultures they contain, it's good for our gut microbiome. Now, this is all good and well, but truth be told, we actually don't know what a healthy gut microbiome looks like. We have all the plant-based crowd that talks about eating fiber gives your gut microbiome something to eat, and when you eat more plants, you have a more diverse bacteria, and that's a good thing. But as we know, humans are not meant to consume plants. So whilst the argument can be made that all these live cultures are good for us, we don't 100% know. But because it contains less carbohydrates, I'm going to chuck it in the C tier along with raw milk. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing down below. I made a video which breaks down all the reasons that we know humans are designed to only eat meat, which I think you'll like, and I'll see you next time.